Welcome to a joint event between the APPG on No Recourse on public funds, and the APPG on migration. I just want to say this session is being recorded, so if you do not want your face to be shown, please feel welcome. We want you to know that you're welcome to turn your camera off. But of course, if you don't mind being recorded, then you can show your face. So I just want to put that out there first and foremost. This session is going to be to discuss the impact of Clause 10.5 of the Nationality and Borders Bill on refugees. Before we properly start, let me first say thank you to Project 17, the Refugee Asylum and Migration Policy Project, and Just Fair for helping put together this event, and also to our speakers who will be introduced in just a moment. Let me also say thank you to everyone for joining this call this afternoon for what I am sure will be a very interesting and worthwhile event. As I said, this event is to draw attention to Clause 10.5 of the Nationality and Borders Bill, which sets out that refugees will be discriminated against based on the method of reaching the UK. The bill sets out that limited services will be granted to refugees on this basis, which means that those deemed to have arrived in what the bill deems the wrong way are more likely to be subject to NRPF condition, have limited rights of family reunion, be granted time-limited leave, and have restricted access to indefinite leave. This could be subject to any refugee who did not travel directly from a territory where their safety was threatened. We believe that this will be devastating consequence of refugees, and I'm sure that our panel of experts and those who have lived experience of living under NRPF will do a great job in explaining the intricacies and damaging aspects of this proposed policy, using all their knowledge to ensure that we are best able to understand and scrutinise these policies in their passage through the House. We hope that this event will help foster understanding of how harmful the 10.5 clause will be and how it will only erode refugee rights, making leave to remain much more conditional, as well as extending the NRPF condition. We hope that everyone gets a lot out of this event. Let me now say thank you for coming, and I will pass over to Baroness Ludford, Sarah, the Vice Chair of the APPG on Migration and Co-Chair of this meeting today, who will introduce the speakers.
Thanks very much, Kate, and I'm pleased to be co-chairing with you. As I've explained to others just before the meeting started, it is with some trepidation that I've become a vice chair of the APPG on migration, very inadequately filling the shoes of my colleague in the Lib Dem group in the Lords, Sally Hamwee, who I think you will all know, who has become a select committee chair and is therefore, more constrained in her activities. I don't know a huge amount about British nationality and asylum, though I have a long interest in it from when I was a member of the European Parliament for 15 years until 7 years ago. So I was much involved with sort of EU legislation in this area. But UK law is far more complex than anything the European Union ever produced, and I have to put a bit of a wet towel on my head every time I encounter the subject. But anyway, I must not go on too much. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. I'll give an overview of all of them before I start with a question to John. John Featonby is Policy and Advocacy Manager refugees and asylum for the British Red Cross. He's served as parliamentary manager for the Refugee Council, has provided secretariat support to inquiries of the APPG on refugees, and he has a master's degree in human rights from Essex University. Jennifer Blair is Senior Legal Protection Advisor at the Helen Bamber Foundation that provides specialist support to survivors of trafficking, torture and extreme cruelty. And she's also a barrister at Number 5 Chambers, where she advises and represents in all areas of immigration, asylum, nationality, deportation, free movement and human rights law. And she's previously delivered training for the No Recourse to Public Funds Network and has other credentials to her name, but I'll stop there. And our third panellist is Chris Harris, who is Policy Coordinator of Project 17, responsible for its policy, parliamentary and research work. She was previously a research and policy worker at Medical Justice, and has been working and volunteering in migrant rights for a decade, and has a PhD from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. We've got some impressive credentials on this panel. So I'm going to start with John. And I should just say that I was working with John because I took over the bill. I think it's been round a bit, but was introduced at one stage by Sally Hamwee in the House of Lords, Private Members Bill on refugee family reunion. So this is something in which I do have a strong interest. So I'm going to. No, it's Kate. Kate, it goes back to you. I'm sorry. I'm getting confused. It goes back to Kate for the first question to John Featonby. Apologies.
No worries. Thank you so much, Sarah. I just wanted to explain the format of the session, which I didn't do in my introduction. Myself and Sarah will ask a series of questions to the panelists, and we will also be hearing testimonies from people with lived experience of living under NRPF. But please don't worry, there will be an opportunity at the end to ask questions, and we would be grateful if you use the chat and just put your questions in there. Of course, if something's burning and you know pressing and you want to ask during, please raise your hand and we'll see if we can take you there. And lastly, one of our speakers, Neil Coyle, who's my fellow Labour MP, and he represents Bermondsey and Old Southwark. He's a member of the Nationality and Borders Bill Committee, and unfortunately he's not been able to attend today. But he has a lot of experience, of course, because he's actually scrutinising the bill. So I just wanted to make sure everyone was clear how the format was going to go. And my first question to John, can you briefly summarise why you are concerned about the suggestion of differentiating between groups of refugees offering limited access to services?
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Sarah, for that introduction as well. I think Sarah downplays her knowledge of all of these things, but she's definitely right in that immigration law in the UK is very complicated. I think one of my general reflections and a reflection from the Red Cross on this bill is that it just makes everything far more complicated for people, both those people going through the system, but for people who are either supporting people in their system or for other statutory organisations who will be working with people in the future as well. And the subject that we're discussing today, Clause 10 of the Nationality and Borders Bill, is a very good example of this in the way that it will treat refugees differently depending on how they entered the country, and is very clear in that it creates two groups of refugees. Group 1 refugees, which as Kate set out, are those who arrived through what the Home Office referred to as regular means, and then Group 2 refugees, which is basically everybody else. So anybody who arrived, say, via a small boat over the Channel, or anybody else who took an irregular path to get to the UK. And I think one of our other reflections from the Red Cross's point of view for the bill is that actually that probably means most refugees will fall into that Group 2 category, because there is a lack of safe and legal ways for refugees to be able to get to the UK and then to go through the asylum system. And I think there are two things that are worth stressing at the outset and are worth keeping in mind as we go through the rest of this conversation. And the first thing is that we are discussing refugees today. The bill covers a lot of different people, whether people seeking asylum, refugees themselves, and also survivors of trafficking, as well as other people going through the immigration system. But for this group, this is people who are refugees, who have been recognised by the UK government as being in need of refugee protection for it to be unsafe for them to return to their country of origin. And I think the other thing that's worth referring to on Clause 10, and anybody who's been watching the Nationality and Borders Bill committee debates over the last few weeks will be aware of on Clause 10, is that while it provides some examples of the ways in which Group 1 and Group 2 refugees can be treated differently, the bill doesn't limit those ways. And actually, most of the detail will be set out in the immigration rules and in guidance to come afterwards as well. So although the bill gives those 4 examples of how the two groups might be differentiated, it is possible that Group 2 refugees could face other restrictions. I mean, they could be on things like healthcare or access to our higher education. But I think that's vitally important, particularly for those parliamentarians on the call, to be aware of that as they go through the rest of the bill process. And I think without wanting to speak for other organisations, and there's many on this call, but in the conversations that the Red Cross have been having with our colleagues within the sector, I think Clause 10 is among those within this bill that elicit the greatest concern. I mean, it's fair to say that there's not much in this bill which is welcome. There's maybe bits within Part 1 of the bill on nationality which rights some historic wrongs. But the whole bill really does undermine the UK's protection system and makes some very worrying changes as well to the way that the UK responds to modern slavery. But among those, Clause 10 is probably the one that most organisations have huge concerns about. And these are for all sorts of different reasons, whether it's the practical implications, the moral implications, and also some of the legal implications. And it's definitely worth everybody's time reading the very detailed legal opinion that the UNHCR, the UN's refugee agency, has published on the bill. And in their discussion of Clause 10, and I quote, they say that it is inconsistent with the Refugee Convention and has no basis in international law. And that hopefully would make anybody stop and think about what Clause 10 actually is trying to do. And from our point of view as the Red Cross, the approach set out in Clause 10 goes completely against our belief that people's protection should be based on their need and not how they enter the country. And that the impact of Clause 10 will be that it will drastically reduce what it means actually to be a refugee in the UK and what protection in the UK means for people. And while the government's argument for differentiating is that it will deter people from making dangerous journeys, there is no evidence that it will actually achieve those aims. And certainly as a British Red Cross, we want to see a reduction in the number of people who are putting their lives at risk taking those dangerous journeys to reach the UK. But the problem with the bill, and with Clause 10 in particular, is that it doesn't actually reflect the underlying reasons why people are trying to seek safety in the UK in the first place, and nor does it provide viable alternative routes for people. And that's not just us, the Red Cross as a humanitarian organisation, saying that, but probably more importantly, it's those people who've lived the experience of the asylum system, the people who've been through those journeys before, who are saying that as well. And as the Red Cross, we work with and support a group called the Voices Network, who have lived the experience of the asylum system and who have made some of those journeys previously. And they took part in the consultation with the Home Office earlier this year on their new plan for immigration. And as part of that consultation, they were very clear that there is nothing in this bill and there is nothing in Clause 10 that would have resulted in them taking a different route. All it would have meant is that when they got to the UK and went through the asylum system, their protection here would have been far less than it is currently. And the fact is that reducing and removing the support and entitlements of refugees doesn't reflect the reasons why people may end up seeking protection here. Some people might get to the UK because they have family or community links, they might speak English, or they might just have a general sense that the UK will be safe for them. It may also be that people quite often just have no real control over where it is that they're going to end up, having set out maybe months or even years beforehand, fleeing that war or persecution or violence, whatever it was that forced them to be displaced. And there's also some international evidence which could have been drawn on to inform Clause 10. The likes of Australia, which is often held up by the UK government as being an example to follow, has gone through similar methods. And I'm sure other speakers will touch on this as well, about introducing some of the things which Clause 10 potentially does. And the evidence is very clear, though, from Australia that none of those things actually reduce the number of people taking dangerous journeys. So So in terms of just what the Red Cross thinks should happen next, and as Kate mentioned, the bill is in the committee stage at the moment in the Commons, and that finishes tomorrow before then going on to report and then into the House of Lords. I think one of our reflections on Clause 10 is that it's pretty hard to amend. Sometimes you look at a clause and you think, okay, if we tweak this and this, it will make it slightly less bad. Clause 10, it's pretty difficult to see where that can happen. We had some very useful debates during the committee stage that maybe flushed out a little bit more information. At least there was a commitment from the Home Office Minister that this wouldn't be introduced retrospectively and wouldn't apply to anybody who had a live asylum claim by the time that Clause 10 is commenced. And that's something, but it just doesn't go far enough. And certainly in the view of the British Red Cross, this clause should not remain part of the bill, and we hope as the bill continues to go through, it will be removed. Potentially there could be some amendments that may exempt particular groups. However, we just are very concerned that just would not go far enough.
Thank you so much, John. I'll hand over to Sarah.
Thanks very much, John. Completely agree with you that the whole of Clause 10 is pernicious, along with a great deal else in this bill. I sort of feel a ping-pong moment coming on, which, as you know, refers to a tug of war between the Commons and the Lords, but maybe I speak too soon. And then the sort of subset of the perniciousness of this clause is that subsections 5 and 6, as you said, say these A to D situations are only examples. So the Secretary of State can can use differential treatment, for example, in these 4 situations, but then they can go off and create other examples in the immigration rules. So it's it's potentially unlimited, and there's no parliamentary control over the immigration rules at all, as far as I understand it. Anyway, let me pass on to the subject, which, as I said, is I had second reading in September of my private member's bill on family reunion. Whether any other stage gets reached is up in the air at the moment. But so the question, John, that I would like to ask you is to tell us why you are concerned about the proposal to limit access to family reunion under Clause 10.5D, based on your experience at the Red Cross. We'll come to one of the other examples in 10.5, which is obviously no recourse to public funds later, but just here on family reunion.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And yes, from the point of view of the British Red Cross, as I said, we're very concerned about Clause 10 in its entirety, but family reunion has a particular place in our hearts at the Red Cross. And for those of you who know our organisation, it's one of the main things that we do. And since 2015, we've supported over 2,500 families to navigate the application process of family reunion. And we also support people once they've got a family reunion visa to be able to then actually travel and be reunited. And it's certainly a moment of joy for us as an organisation, as our team seeing those families who maybe been split apart for months, years, in some places decades, to be reunited again. And that's why we're very concerned about the family reunion element of this differentiated treatment. Now, just a little bit of background on family reunion. At the moment, an adult refugee in the UK is able to sponsor their spouse or their partner and any children under the age of 18 to join them. And actually, when the government talk a lot about safe and legal routes, I think it's worth noting that family reunion is the most numerous, and that up to in the last 5 years, over 30,000 family reunion visas have been granted, and that compares to sort of 22,500 people who arrive through resettlement. And also 9 in 10 of every family reunion visa is granted to a woman or a child. So it is one of the few existing safe routes, and does focus on probably what the Home Secretary might refer to as some of the more vulnerable groups. But the problem that we see with the implications of Clause 10 is that the majority of those families who have been able to reunite, and those majorities of those families that the British Red Cross has been able to support to reunite, potentially would not have been able to be together again had Clause 10 been in place when they were trying to go through that process. And so not only is it damaging one of those safe routes, it is damaging the most numerous safe routes at the moment, and the bill does nothing else to expand ones as well. But not just from that point of view, it's also that it's potentially just puts a further barrier in terms of the prospects for refugees to be able to integrate. And again, from the sponsors, the refugee sponsors in the UK that we work with, for many people, even though they've gone through the asylum system, they've got their refugee status, until they're able to be joined by their family, they kind of feel that their life continues to be on hold. And this is, again, something that the Voices Network set out in their response to New Plan for Immigration. And they said that they know how difficult it is to rebuild their lives without their families by their side. And very plainly, they said that preventing family reunion will damage individuals, will damage families and communities, and prevent positive integration. And Ahmad, who's one of the ambassadors of the Voices Network, who arrived in the UK from Syria through so-called irregular routes and then was able to reunite with his family after 4 years being apart from them, stressed the devastating impact of family separation on him. And he said that my family is part of me. Without them, I lost my identity. I lost my hope to live. I felt like my oxygen had gone and I couldn't breathe. So family reunion is vitally important, not just because it provides a safe route and maybe means that some people aren't taking dangerous journeys, which is something that the Home Office have also said they want to see, but it just damages integration and what protection means for somebody who does go on to get refugee status in the UK. And just building on the point that Sarah made as well around how the detail of this will be set out in the immigration rules, all the bill kind of says is that the type of leave that Group 2 refugees will get will restrict family reunion rights without actually setting out the detail about what that means. And it could mean all sorts of different things. It could mean that actually it's something that we need to be less worried about. It could be something that we need to be very, very worried about. But it's worth stressing that actually the minister, in response to the debate on clause 10 in the bill committee in the Commons, said that basically any Group 2 refugees will not have family reunion rights other than where it would, to deny them family reunion rights, would go against their Article 8 rights, the right to family life. Which in some ways, and goes back to the point around making the immigration system even more complex, for anybody who is aware in any way in the way that Article 8 works in any other bits of the immigration rules, it is fantastically complicated. And certainly in our work with the Home Office on family reunion over the last 5 or 6 years, the Home Office have been trying to simplify the family reunion process. Now, this completely undoes that. And one of the things actually that Baroness Ludford, Sarah's Prime Member's Bill, seeks to do is to reintroduce legal aid for refugee family reunion as well. So actually, if the Home Office are going to go down this route, again, one of the very least things they could do is to make sure that legal aid is going to be available for those families to try and limit the damaging impact that restricting family reunion will have on families.
Thanks very much, John. I mean, just briefly, this whole scenario of this bill is perverse. The problem in the asylum system is the backlog and the long waits that people have and the way that their mental and physical health deteriorates while they're having to go through all this, and they can't get their family and they can't get themselves up and running in the community, at work or whatever. So you would think the priority was to simplify everything, process applications as efficiently and effectively as possible. But they're just making it more complicated, more subject to legal challenge, more expensive, more stupid. Anyway, it just blows one's mind, really, the whole thing. Anyway, it's not me you want to hear talking, it's our panellists, and I promise you this is, I'm not going to keep asking all the questions. I actually have to go before the end of the event, so I get upfront privileges, which is to ask the next question, which is to Jennifer Blair, who, as I said, is from the Helen Bamber Foundation. Jennifer, at the foundation, you work with refugees and asylum seekers who have suffered trauma in their country of origin, on the journey here, or in the UK. So based on your experience working with this group of people, can you tell us about the potential impact of the proposal to offer a limited leave to remain with limited access to routes to settlement as a consequence in terms of mental health, well-being and integration for this group and crucially for wider society.
Yes, thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm from the Helen Bamber Foundation, and we provide a model of integrated care for survivors of torture, trafficking and human rights abuses. So we see directly the impact where people are granted refugee status and 5 years legal protection on a route to settlement or other forms of leave, or where people are waiting for a decision for a very long time. Research from HBF clinicians suggests that in the 12 months after a person is first granted leave to remain, their mental health will often fluctuate and deteriorate as they experience different forms of instability as they begin to rebuild their life. With a process where instead they have to make renewals every 30 months, this instability will never go away. Protection, as John explained, would be weakened for people who are accepted as genuine refugees. So this degrading and separation of different kinds of refugees is disregarding the seriousness of past mistreatment. At HBF, we run a medico-legal report service, so we document human rights abuses amongst refugee populations and see how catastrophic the experiences of human cruelty many refugees have experienced in the past. We offer therapeutic services, but the effectiveness of therapy is undermined when a person's circumstances are unstable. Clinicians will often decline to undertake trauma-focused therapy with someone in an unstable situation. The person may not have the resilience to cope with the therapy, or they may not benefit from it. Evidence-based trauma-focused therapy is a key component in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. So by keeping refugees in perpetual instability, as the bill envisages, this will prevent recovery. And post-traumatic stress disorder can have life-changing implications. It can be profoundly disabling, but it's also extremely distressing for the person affected, who will experience repeated intrusive reminders of the worst experiences in their life. PTSD is linked with increased suicidality, and complex PTSD has a long-term impact on interpersonal relationships and risks of further abuse and exploitation. So that's the circumstances people will be in. But the process of navigating repeated applications for leave to remain is also extremely complex. So it involves making a valid application. And if a valid application is not submitted, it will be rejected outright with no right of appeal. For it to be valid, it has to go through a specific process, have specific mandatory documents, and use a rigid and often misleading English language online application process, where until you've got to the end of the application, you can't actually see what supporting evidence you have to submit with it. And the list of supporting documents you're told to submit is often not actually correct. So people will, and this includes refugees who are illiterate, who may have learning difficulties, whose education may have been disrupted by war and conflict, may have arrived in the UK as children, will go through this process where there are multiple administrative stages where things will go wrong. We frequently see people on a 10-year route to settlement who make mistakes in that process and fall outside of the system. So they might, for example, when they think they're renewing their leave to remain, instead apply use the form when you've lost your biometric residence permit, because that sounds to them like, oh, I need a new residence permit, let me do this form. It's not the right form, left as an overstayer. Or when they want to apply for indefinite leave to remain, then instead fill in the form for a first British passport, thinking that that's the right form. Again, quite intuitively, again, leaves them as an overstayer. And overstayers are illegally present. It has enormous financial and legal ramifications, and potentially people will be criminalised as a result. That includes parents. It includes, again, the people with the kind of profile I discussed earlier and that level of vulnerabilities. But even people with 30 months leave to remain, or who do apply in time, are unattractive to employers and landlords because their situation seems so unstable, the situation is complex and it's not well understood. If you apply in time to renew your leave, you're given this kind of statutory extended leave under Section 3C of the Immigration Act. But people don't know what that is, and people regularly lose their jobs or are told to stop working by employers who are afraid of employing somebody not legally present. So we see people living in long-term precariousness and poverty as a result of short grants of leave. And for survivors of abuse, this creates a further risk of exploitation and human trafficking. We run a specialist counter-trafficking program at HBF, and this kind of poverty and high application fees or legal fees, which I'll come to in a moment, can be a particular risk factor in terms of re-trafficking. The people we work with are desperate to move on with their lives and be British, have a sense of belonging to their country of their residence. But with this provision, each renewal of leave to remain would require the person to revisit in full the reason they would be at risk on return, meaning that every couple of years, the person will have to go back to the experience of torture, mistreatment, some of, again, the worst experiences in their lives. Avoidance of recalling traumatic memories is a clinical symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder. So it can be extremely unpleasant and even impossible for people to recall traumatic memories. But for refugee protection under this bill, every 30 months it will be mandatory, because otherwise you face a risk of return to a country where you would experience persecution. So in professional opinion, based on the clients I work with, there will be people who cannot cope with that process, and they will fall outside of the system into severe destitution and homelessness. In turn, this group will lose the stability, and as John discussed, about family reunion, but also of the route to settlement. So that indefinitely to remain settlement offers permission to live and work without restriction. Children will be born British, offering particular stability to stateless refugees. And indefinite leave to remain is an important stepping stone to naturalisation. Loss of settlement directly means loss of identity, belonging and stability. And research we've done at HBF into the health of refugees and asylum accommodation shows that perceptions of feeling unwelcome directly impact on mental health. We also run a community and integration program where we see the way that the stability on the 5-year route to settlement allows people to retrain, develop businesses. We often support people to go into higher education, including things like women from Afghanistan who never had the chance to have education before. And these provisions will make that just unrealistic for people granted this temporary form of protection. And so without that access to rebuilding and making a positive life for themselves in their community, they will experience longer term social exclusion. And that has impacts on racial equality, echoes of the Windrush scandal, and social exclusion. There are also practical issues in terms of resources for this proposal. At the moment, the Home Office has an ever-increasing backlog in decision-making. So I am regularly seeing people who've been waiting 3 years for a decision on an asylum claim. If each one of those now has to reapply every 2.5 years, how is the Home Office going to manage that decision-making backlog? Similarly with legal aid, every time a legal aid lawyer takes on a client for a renewal, that's one fewer new client they can take on. And with legal aid, since the legal aid cuts, we've seen basically a collapse in the legal aid, immigration and asylum sector, with demand for good quality immigration advice far outstripping what is available. The problem with that is that otherwise people will be making applications without legal advice or with poor quality legal advice, making the wrong application, making applications that can't succeed, and again, falling outside of the system through no fault of their own. The final points I wanted to make quickly were that the ideology around this bill treats asylum seekers as if they were all single men with no vulnerabilities and who have done something wrong. But that's far from the truth. These provisions will affect the most vulnerable people, at-risk men, children, families, women survivors of serious abuse and exploitation. And the children of refugees who are born in the UK will also be affected. Some of those will be British children through another parent. Some of those will be caught by these provisions in a legal limbo from birth. The GLA estimates there's already 215,000 undocumented children in the UK, and this provision would increase that number, in my opinion. In addition, if a woman with only 30 months leave to remain with an NRPF condition with downgraded refugee protection is a victim of domestic violence, she will often feel forced to stay in that relationship because she's got nowhere else to go. That was something we saw regularly in other immigration contexts before the destitution domestic violence concession was brought into force, and that provision will not cover this category of people. Although the Secretary of State has suggested it will be possible to lift the NRPF conditions if a person is destitute, destitution is very hard to prove. There are few and no nationwide services to help people remove the NRPF condition. And in our professional experience, many people with an NRPF condition don't know that they can have it removed. So we see families all the time living in poverty who didn't know there was any other option. People are also too scared to apply to remove the NRPF condition because they believe it's going to affect their substantive case when it comes to renewal or settlement. And finally, given the instability of this route, many people won't be able to cope with staying on something where you're renewing your leave periodically with no guarantee that it will work and all the issues I've raised. So people will then try and move to another immigration route. And some people will be able to, for example, access the 10-year private life route, which at the moment refugees wouldn't, because it's a much worse kind of protection and much less stable. For the 4 renewals to settlement that you would need to take on that route to get indefinitely to remain, you'd be paying over £12,000, so £12,761 plus administrative costs, and that's per person. So again, if you're a refugee family, that's an extraordinary sum of money. And again, there is, in theory, fee waivers available under that route, but there's very limited access to legal advice for them, and we regularly see people getting into debt to pay those fees. So between those fees and legal fees, often of around £3,000 per renewal, the risk of victims of exploitation getting into debt bondage and re-trafficking to pay associated fees is a genuine and serious risk. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. There's so much that you've laid out there, and I would say, as a parliamentarian, there are so many constituents that approach me who have put in poor quality applications. And then, so if there's any parliamentarians on this call, please put some questions in the chat box, or if your staff are here, please use the chat box to explore that further so we can actually give the best support possible, because we are a route into the Home Office, which unfortunately not having very good solicitors out there, and sometimes the ones that are very good are inundated with applications. We are a gateway in supporting applications. Now I'm going to move on now to Chris Harris. Chris is part of the Secretariat for the all-party group, but Chris, in her day job, amongst many things, is she works at Project 17, and she is the policy coordinator. So in your role, Chris, the clause 10.5 proposes to impose NRPF condition on refugees offered temporary protection status. Based on your experience at Project 17, why do you feel this is problematic?
Hi everyone. Yes, I work with Project 17, and we are a very small organisation, but we help families who are currently have no recourse to public funds and who are experiencing exceptional poverty to access help from local authorities under Section 17 of the Children's Act. So we see a lot of people affected by the no recourse to public funds condition. As John has described earlier, the Clause 10 proposes to differentiate the treatment of refugees based on the means by which they arrived in the country. And one of those proposed limitations is to offer refugees in Group 2 leave subject to the no recourse to public funds condition. So this would mean that refugees, just to clarify what no recourse to public funds actually means, it's stipulated in the immigration rules a specific list of things that you cannot access. So that is the main welfare benefits as well as social housing. In addition to that, there are many other forms of support which you can't access because they are what we call passported. And that is just a technical term for saying that you can't get one unless you have the other. A lot of support you can only get if you're currently getting universal credit. So if you're banned from getting universal credit, then you can't access those forms of support either, even though they're not specifically set up out as public funds. So in terms of like what John said, it's extremely worrying to us that these are just some limitations that the government chose to include in the bill, and that it's been left so open what can further be limited. But in terms of clarification that the government has offered during the passing of the bill, is that the NRPF condition will not be applied to anyone who was receiving asylum support whilst they were going through the asylum process. And the reasoning for that is that in order to get asylum support, you have to pass the destitution test. And so therefore it's accepted that you would be destitute without this support and you will not be subject to this NRPF condition. However, they've also said that they're not worried about applying the NRPF condition to other people because they will have access to making an application to have that condition lifted if they are destitute or if they're facing risk of destitution. Further to that, and Jennifer touched on this already, they're going to reimpose the NRPF condition most likely on each subsequent 30-month leave that the people get. So they have to go through the process again. Now, that's just to set the stage of really what is being proposed here. As John said, we don't really know. A bill is a very kind of skeleton outline of the intention, but actually all the meat and all the limitations will be set out in guidance that comes later, and that's where we really find out what and how this will be applied. But from Project 17's point of view, and to answer your question, Kate, what we see is the first-hand negative impact that NRPF has on families and the families that we see. We see people driven to homelessness. We see people becoming vulnerable to exploitation. We see people finding it more difficult to escape abusive situations. People live in overcrowded and unsuitable accommodation. Many aren't aware that they can apply to have this removed. And what we see is a direct negative impact on the health and well-being of the children in these families. We see inability to participate on the same level as everyone else. We see social exclusion. We see mental health problems. And all of these, down to the very basics of children not having enough to eat, not being able to cover essentials, toiletries, nappies, all of these things. And the suggestion that being able to make an application to have these lifted is patently not enough based on the evidence that we have submitted time and time again to the government, to committees, to the courts, to the media, to the stories of how this actually affects the people currently subject to this condition. There's no reason to think that it will be any difference if so that evidence is currently well known and well evidenced, and the suggestion that this condition would be applied to even further groups. We've been arguing passionately for years that this, the NRPF condition needs to end. We have to find other ways of dealing with this, and to extend it to even further groups of people, in particular, a group of refugees who have come to this country, have a recognized protection need, but more than that, just the practicalities of it. They've already been in the asylum system for at least a year, which means they haven't been allowed to work, which means that they're and many, as Jennifer just outlined, will suffer the impact of the trauma that they may have experienced before. And so that the likelihood that this group of people will get a job straight away when at the grant of refugee status is quite low, and the likelihood that they will enter destitution is quite high. And so to put in a blanket application of no recourse public funds just means that you will have a lot of people who need to make an application to have this lifted because of the circumstances that they're living in. And that just generates more bureaucratic burdens. It increases the backlog and does quite the opposite of what the government says that they intend to do with this bill. But however, the most important thing here, I think, is the negative impact that it has on the lives of people. And you don't have to take my word for it, because today we are lucky enough to have two people with actual lived experience present here today who have agreed to share their experience with us and talk to us about what it's actually like to live under this condition. So I will hand over first to Nika, who's joined us today. She is part of Project 17's lived experience group called United Impact. And good afternoon, Nika. Are you with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you. Good afternoon.
Wonderful. Thank you for agreeing to speak to us today. Can you tell us a little bit about how being subject to the NRPF condition affected you and your family?
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, everybody. NRPF has had and still has a very negative impact on my family. We had an unsuitable living arrangement because of immigration application was being delayed. We were given an eviction notice from the council in which we were living at the time. That was in 2019. We were referred to Children's Services because I had no right to rent, no right to work, and could no longer stay in their property. So on the due date, we were evicted. Children's Services refused to engage. Rather, they contacted my ex-partner who I had separated from due to domestic violence. They suggested that my children, which we shared together, be given back to him, and threatened that if I refuse, he should go back to court to demand custody because of lockdown and my current situation. And that if he goes back to the court, they will write in his favor, which was what eventually happened. He went to court, and as we had nowhere to stay at the time, the court allowed him to have the children. I've got 6 children, 3 I shared with him, but the 3 older ones had lost their fathers, so they're stuck with me. You can just imagine how 4 years and 5-year-olds at the time. I've got 2 4-year-olds, they were twins, and 5-year-old, abruptly separated from their mom and their older brothers, whom they have lived with all their lives. But there was nothing I could do at the time. It was very devastating. That was very tough, and for 2 consecutive months, we could not see nor interact face-to-face, and telephone conversation was being controlled by their father, who had always had controlling behavior. We were helpless as it was just lockdown, which started in March 2020. I relied on the church, the local church we were attending, to pay for a hotel, and eventually moved into a guest house. Whilst I was talking to social services about Section 17 support. It was actually about the time I got referred to Project 17, who eventually helped reach out to the children's services of the local council, which I was at the time. And it was very, very destabilizing, really, coupled with the homelessness situation and every other thing that was going on. Our MP at that time could not help, neither could charities, homeless charities, because of NRPF. This treatment make me, and I believe the children with me, downhill, including the children that were separated with me at that time. Emotionally, psychologically, we were destabilized. I was depressed and, anxious, not having my children with me. So even though the 3 of the children are British citizens, I couldn't claim benefit for them because of NRPF. And eventually the other 3 got supported under the Section 17 support by the Children's Services, which is what I am using to manage the whole family now, because I've got my children back through the help of legal aids. When Jennifer was talking, I actually felt like, the whole of my story is being told again to me. And I've got my children back. We all stay together now, but I couldn't get any financial support for them because of NRPF. We have continued to live with this. And while the Home Office takes their time to make a decision about my immigration status and that of the 3 older children who are non-British. So the most frustrating part of having NRPF is not having right to work, because I've got many skills. Currently, I volunteer with charities for free of skills that I could have been paid for. But because I needed a professional development opportunity, which I'm still grateful for, NRPF is a very terrible thing and very restrictive. And I was just thinking, in line with every other speakers have been talking about, if this had to be extended to, even to more people, it can be more disastrous to more people, really, because somebody seeking refuge is seeking security and protection, seeking basic needs, basic human rights and needs. But they end up coming to a place and being faced with more harsh conditions that could cause more emotional distress and cause people to end up in dangerous situations, even causing future problems for their children, homelessness, gangsterism, and so on and so forth, that we see as some of the vices in the society we live in. I'm thinking about the provision of Section 17 support. Most people in our group, including me, had experienced great difficulties in accessing this support, as earlier mentioned briefly in my experience of homelessness during the lockdown. Some of these difficulties are not but limited to being turned away, being told you weren't eligible for support, long delays before eventually getting the support, being disbelieved by social services, and so on. So NRPF is not something to be encouraged in the society, which is a country that a lot of people look up to. My desire is that no one should go through this hardship, which I have struggled with and lived with the negative consequences. I would like to ask that the parliamentarians in this place should please oppose this limitation to the bill going through the parliament now, as understood by the speeches made earlier. Thank you.
Thank you, Nika. Thank you for sharing that with us. I think you make it very clear how disastrous the NRPF condition is for individuals and families, and the long-term effects that it has on people. And I think you're very right to mention the limitations that people face when they're trying to access support under Section 17, being turned away, being disbelieved, having hostile gatekeeping tactics, there's no protection. I think this is something that we see a lot of Project 17, people basically facing situations which constitute a breach of their Article 3 rights. So very, very severe impacts. That can't have been easy for you to share with us, Nika, but it was very powerful and I think very important for us to hear. Next, I'm going to ask Aishatu if you're here.
Just before you pass on, and I can't find a way to let in chat, I just want to apologise that, as mentioned to the other panellists and Kate at the beginning, I have to go because I've got a 2 o'clock till 5 o'clock session. So thank you very much to everybody, and especially just now to Nika, and I apologise I can't stay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. Aishatu, if you're there, do you want to share how NRPF has affected you and your family with us?
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you everyone for giving me this opportunity to share with you my experience. And I know thousands out there are living with my experience or have lived my experience before. NRPF is like something very damaging, and it causes a lot of trauma. It still upsets me, really, thinking about all that I've been through. The damages is not only physical, but also psychological. I used to have, self-confidence. I used to be like a bold activist, someone that can speak up. But going through such condition, it drains my confidence level. And I end up thinking less of a human, of myself. There is no dignity in living with NRPF. You do not have enough money for your children, and the living situation is always terrible, especially the residents. Because I had NRPF, I had no access to benefits. and no access to public housing. I tried to access support from 2 councils and I was refused. They used many tactics and gatekeeping to refuse me support, and I was left homeless with a 3-month-old daughter by then, who is a British citizen. After intervention from Project 17, the Southern Council eventually provided us with Section 17 accommodation and financial support. The money was not enough. For people without any advocate, it's often impossible to get the support. There was no floor space in the room, and I had to live in that condition over a year period. And my daughter, who during that period had to go through certain processes like crawling, training to walk, will most times do all of these things on the bed because the room was very, very tight. Other residents are also very stressed and emotionally, having been under the same condition for years, and it affects also the confidence of their children. I was worried about complaining to the council because there was a time when it was during the winter season, last winter season, and the ceiling was all muddy, and the mud was coming down even on the wall where we were sleeping close to the bed. I was scared to complain because I thought that might affect my immigration process at the Home Office by then. Also, when there is problem with the electric heater, it becomes really difficult to contact the agency to come and do certain amendments. It will take sometimes a week or 2 for them to come and do fixing. Having to use electric heater instead of gas ran up very high cost. I could not afford a buggy. Most of the time when I want to ask for some items like buggy or toy for my daughter by then, I'll have to ask my advisor at Project 17, and she will have to refer me to other charities for those items because the money that was given for financial support was not enough to get these other items. Currently, I got recourse to public fund for 30 months, and I'm living in a council accommodation. But even that, my condition is very, very unstable because my solicitor applied for another process through the Zambrano route, and I don't know if at all I will be granted, and even if I'm granted, I'll go again. My situation will go back to the NRPF condition instead of me having access to benefits. I was fortunate, but I was awarded a full scholarship to study data analytics. And during my course of study, I was compelled to use my hotspot from my phone because I can't really have access to Wi-Fi. I can't even afford it. It was difficult. So my suggestions or recommendation, I'm pleading to policymakers, to lawmakers, to MPs. The NRPF policy is way too harsh. The government should come with something that will actually help people to go through the immigration process with less worries, because some people that come to the UK, they have skills, they have ability, and they will actually contribute to the economy of the UK and make a bigger positive impact if they are less stressed and they have like a free mindset and they have the ability to earn their own money without thinking about, tedious immigration processes or thinking about how am I going to survive the next day. Every human has a unique quality. Some people migrate due to different reasons. It might be because of war, climate change, and if they come to the UK, it does not mean that they are less for human. They have something to contribute to the economy, obviously. If laws are stifling them, how do you expect them to contribute to the society? They are living danger to come to safety and face even harsher conditions. There should be a system where people can work freely and contribute to the society, to not be reliant on state funds. If you stifle and interrogate people all the time, and if the system to even like process their immigration documents for them to have legal stay is tedious and complex, then it causes a high, it's like a recipe for high mental health cases in the society. And that's a problem for future generation. This can be avoided if the UK try to look into the laws, especially the one that has to do with this NRPF. The UK has a very hostile environment. It is the harsh reality for too many people with no rights to benefit, no rights to work, and no rights to rent. NRPF is not a human right. It is very much inhumane, and please, it should be changed. I thank you all for giving me your attention.
Thank you, Ashatu. Thank you for coming to share your story with us. That can't have been easy. And you say that you used to be an activist. I think you're still one, and thank you for speaking up today. It's very important that we got to hear how it affected you and your family, and I'm sorry you've had to live through that. I'm gonna Nika and Ashatu will still be here for the Q&A session. I'm gonna pass back to Kate.
Kate has to leave. Chris has asked for
there you go.
Over the chair. Yeah.
Right, I will take over. So I just wanted to thank everyone for coming today and for sharing their contributions. It's been very powerful for me to hear, and I'm sure for everyone else who's come to the event today. I'm going to open up for some questions, and